Welcome to episode 20 of the Catholic Frequency Podcast. This conversation was originally recorded on the social media platform X in an audio space with our friend Imperator, who is a biblical scholar and classic historian from Australia. We start out this conversation, which is about Saint Thomas Aquinas on the virtues, with just the basic question: what are virtues?
Excellent. Yeah. So virtues are basically acts that we do, the habituations of certain activities that I guess you could say that are good for us, that lead to human flourishing. So if we're going back to like Plato and Aristotle and even the Stoics, virtues are those activities that are in accordance with our nature, that direct us towards our end, or our telos, which is like what we're meant to be. So if we look at something simple like a table, a good table, a virtuous table, is one that fulfills its purpose. So one that's sturdy, that essentially a sturdy bench that can kind of lift things and hold things for you, and that makes it a good table. That makes it a virtuous table because it's in accordance with its nature. Whereas with a person, that's a little bit more complicated. What makes a person fulfill their purpose in accordance with their nature? And different religions and philosophies throughout the world have different interpretations of how that's done. But as we'll come to discover through the work of Saint Thomas Aquinas, we basically need the four cardinal virtues, which are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And obviously there's the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity.
Let me ask you about this, because the Catholic Church teaches these 7 heavenly virtues, the theological virtues, the 3 you mentioned, and the 4 cardinal virtues. But the cardinal virtues is an idea that goes back even I guess into ancient Greece. Why? How has the Church adopted this? Why? What makes that like something the Catholic Church should have adopted?
That's a good question. So basically, when you look at Saint Thomas Aquinas, who is kind of the penultimate philosopher and theologian in the Middle Ages, who I guess is for lack of a better term, like the poster child of scholasticism, which is like the Catholic Church's official theological and philosophical framework. Pope Leo XIII even says something to the effect of Saint Thomas Aquinas is the most venerated of all the ancient doctors because he inherits the intellect of all the early church fathers and philosophers that came before him. I tend to think on a more personal level, he must have had like an eidetic memory or something like that. Obviously, he's infused with grace, but the ability for him to, I guess, just absorb the information and absorb the works of all these ancient Greco-Roman pagan philosophers and historians and philosophers, and then combine that with divine revelation, and then create this concise Summa Theologiae, but then he also has Summa Contra Gentiles and a few other texts. He really is almost like the final form, or the final product of the Western intellectual tradition. So it's kind of, he takes what was good, true, and beautiful from natural reason, which was perfectly expressed almost perfectly expressed through the Greco-Roman philosophers, and then he infuses that with grace, and that's how we get things like the Summa Theologiae, which are just this. If you've ever read it, it's phenomenal. I've never read it. I'm in the process of reading it front to back now, and it takes a long time because it's pretty dense, and you have to sit there and think about certain things, and you have to sit there and go, oh, I don't actually really understand what he means there. I need to go back and read it again. But it's phenomenal. Read it bits and pieces, innumerable times, but really going through it front to back for the first time now, and it's just been amazing. I highly encourage anyone who has a decent background in philosophy to read through it.
I don't want to get too distracted, but for somebody who's never read it, and let's say they look it up right now, it's got these things like objections, and how would you sort of describe maybe the best way for like a total newbie if they wanted to sort of read this, which is a great hefty work?
Yeah, it's actually really dense. And the funny thing is, when you actually read the Summa Theologiae, what he does is he steelmans every single argument against the Catholic position. So when it comes to something like, I'm just going to make this up, like, why is justice important? He'll give you every reason, or 3 of the best reasons, and steelman the argument as to why justice isn't important, or, objections to why justice is a virtue and things like that. And you read his steelman objections at the start, and you're actually like, oh wow, this is pretty compelling stuff. He actually makes a solid argument. And then you pause for a second, and then he gives you the replies, and then he just breaks every single argument. And you're like, okay, that's why he's the greatest, because he just deconstructs a steelman argument for pretty much every single premise that he lays out. So it's not just that you're getting this text that just gives you Saint Thomas Aquinas' views. It almost has like a didactic sort of, question and answer sort of structure, and that's why it's so compelling and so strong, because like I said, he steelmans every argument. So if you've have a background in philosophy and understand basic sort of philosophical principles, and then you read the Summa, he actually gives you the complete playbook how to basically defend almost every single argument you can come up against. So a lot of people want to do certain more like interactive expos where I ask a particular question, and it kind of not gets heated, but gets a bit of traction with comments and things like that. I'm just pulling up Saint Thomas Aquinas arguments. It's not my own theories. It's not my own thoughts. I'm to be honest, I'm not that smart. But he just lays out all these arguments so perfectly that if you've just read them once and you understand them, it just gives you like a very strong apologetic framework to kind of answer almost all questions that you can possibly get.
One of our previous spaces, you said this phrase about prudence. I think it was being the mother of all virtues. So when we think about the cardinal virtues, there's 4 of them: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. It's not like you sort of mix them all up in any way you take them, right? There's a certain order to them. Will you talk about that?
Yeah, so this comes down to Aristotle. And for those who know, Aristotle was the student of Plato, who was himself the student of Socrates. So like I guess you could say the fathers of Hellenistic philosophy. And Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, which again, I highly encourage everyone to read, he basically lays out the virtues that you need in order to have like a functioning state or a city state, and how to live what he calls eudaimonia, which means to human flourishing. So if you want to be a good person and you want to live according to your nature and achieve what you're meant to achieve and essentially fulfill your purpose in life, both on a natural and supernatural level, the only way you could accomplish that is to have the 4 cardinal virtues, because they essentially direct you and to your final end and lead to your own flourishing, again, on a natural and supernatural level. So the first one he would say is prudence, which in Greek would be like phronesis. Again, my Greek isn't great. And the Latins would say prudentia, which is obviously where we get the word prudence from. And that's practical wisdom. So that's knowing the means to achieve an end. And that's essentially being able to discern within a given moment which of the, I guess you could say, sub-virtues, or which of the cardinal virtues and their daughter virtues, and I guess this is something that we can get into later because it's not just 4, it then breaks out into like 64, which particular virtue and to what extent you need to apply that particular virtue in a given situation. So that's the virtue of prudence. So if I could give a practical example, let's say I'm walking down the street and I'm with my family, and a young man bumps into me and knocks my shoulder and, spills some of the coffee that I'm holding in my hand, onto my clothes and onto the floor. In accordance with prudence, I wouldn't sit there and say, okay, I need to get into a violent altercation with this man because he spilled my coffee and bumped me. It's clearly an accident. The guy apologized. If I apply, or if I use prudence, if I use phronesis, I would say the level of, I guess you could say, courage or aggression that I need right now is very low. I don't need to do anything. Okay, we can just exchange, polite, gestures. Sorry, man, it's all good. Thank you. Sorry. Have a good day. Alternatively, if I'm in my house in the middle of the night and someone breaks in and is going to my children's room, using phronesis or using prudence, the level of aggression or courage that I need will have to be significantly higher depending on the circumstance that I have an armed intruder in my house. So I know that's a very extreme example, but I like to use examples in extremes because it helps people visualize what I'm trying to say. You would see, like, even in your own day, everyone in this space has probably seen, people who bump into each other and starts like a violent altercation, in a shopping center or a mall or, out in public. That's because neither of those people, they definitely have the virtue of fortitude, like they're courageous, they're ready to fight, but they completely lack the virtue of prudence, which is knowing when to do it. So all these virtues kind of interlock with one another. So the first virtue is prudence, which is basically knowing the means to attain an end. You know what needs to be done in a particular situation in accordance with your state in life and in proportion to what is actually necessary considering the circumstances.
It's also not just knowing not what's good for you, right? But for those around you, your family, even the common good of other people beyond that, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that's, I guess, to make it a bit like, political, I guess. That's what was coming out with this whole this recent interview that JD Vance did when he was talking about your obligations to the government and your own obligations to your community and how it extends outwards. That's actually a perfect sort of expression of the virtue of prudence and justice, because the extent to which you are responsible for others is not only the virtue of prudence, but it's also, not only justice, but it's prudence, because you have to be able to discern which people need your immediate attention more. And that actually is very important. That seems to be something that we've lost because, again, like the interview was saying, we tend to, in the Western world, have such a great sort of, and again, I'm not trying to get all like involved in political conflicts around the world. We are so concerned with what's happening overseas, but then we have unbelievable, crime rates and homelessness and inflation and communities are breaking apart because of drugs and crime. That is your immediate attention. Prudence will tell you what is most immediate to me. It's actually my community. And again, that's the Catholic principle of subsidiarity. We have to take our attention and care for what is most immediate to us in accordance with our organic sort of community. People seem to have lost that sort of that idea. So everything is always this external, abstract, we're going to help humanity in general. Okay, how about we use prudence and focus on what we have to actually do in our communities, in our families? That's how you change the world. It's not some, abstract concept of, Dostoevsky says revolutionaries love humanity in general, but they hate human beings in particular. And I think that's very true with what we're seeing today. Everyone loves people from across the world, helping everyone from around the world, but people don't love the people within their own neighborhood, within their own street. You need to actually help those people first. That's a practical application of both prudence and justice.
I think Mother Teresa said that once when she was first becoming famous. People went to Calcutta and said, what can we do to help? And she's like, help the people in your hometown, in your country. Like help the poor where you are first. I know that certainly our politicians in the United States have very few virtues, not much prudence, but they wrap themselves in all these wonderful terms like justice, like they want to help all these poor people. That's a Christian ideal, right? To help the poor. But part of justice is giving people what is their due. And for example, the United States cannot give every person on earth food and shelter without harming the people of the United States. When millions of people are here illegally, it's driving up housing prices, right? Supply and demand, hurting the poor in the United States. So I know a lot of people, certainly a lot of Catholics, were happy to see the comments from the Vice President of the United States. And you're in Australia, so how does that play like in another Western country?
Just before I get into that specifically, that's one of the reasons why when you're talking about the example with Mother Teresa, when you looked at, when Dr. Jordan Peterson became so famous and kind of exploded onto the cultural scene, he had this whole idea of, if you want to change the world, go clean your room. And everyone always thought like, that's a silly sort of metaphor. Why would you say that? But it's actually very important and very true. The way that you change the world is not by going out and, making a quote unquote difference. You actually have to fix yourself first before you can then it emanates outwards. You fix yourself, and again, no one's ever going to be perfect, so you're always going to have to be working on yourself. But you focus on yourself as an individual, then you move out to your family, then you move out to your community, then you move out to your nation. The way you fix nations isn't like a top-down sort of totalitarian, this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to enforce all these rules on you. The way that nations change is it's a culture change within the family unit, because individuals are virtuous, and virtuous individuals create virtuous communities create virtuous nations. So everyone keeps talking about how our politicians and our priests and our bishops and our cardinals, whatever, they're all corrupt, they're not good. Where do you think they come from? They don't fall from the sky like rain and pop out of the ground like, strawberries. They come from families. Of course, if you want to have a good, strong culture, you have to have good, strong children, good, strong families, and engender virtues in their children. So that's the first part. The second part to your question is in regards to what's happening in America, and that it's very true that people tend to. Okay, how can I put this? There's people that basically use this strange brand of liberation theology, which anyone who knows anything about theology just knows that liberation theology is just Christian Marxism, and is completely incompatible with Christianity, incompatible with Catholicism, because it is just Marxism, but with just a Christian face. And, it's all about this class warfare and, weaponizing the poor against people. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for helping the disadvantaged and the disenfranchised and those marginalized within society. And it's your duty as a Christian to help them. But in proportion to all the other obligations that you have, like you said, if you have in America for the last 4 years, where the crime, the drug rates, the inflation and the loss of income and the lifestyle changes and housing crisis and all these things, and then you want to bring in 10 million illegal, I'm not even going to say illegal immigrants, because that's a contradiction of terms. You can't be an illegal and an immigrant, because an immigrant is a legal sort of person who immigrates to your country. People who come to your country, whether or not their intentions are good or not. Okay, I'm not saying every single person who tries to go into America is automatically like wishing harm on the country, but you can't violate one principle of justice in accordance with this abstract form of social justice, which is basically just liberation theology, in order to quote unquote make the world a better place. The government's, and every government, I don't care which government it is, the government's primary obligation is to its own citizens first. Their security, their wealth, their prosperity, their moral health, I guess you could say. Then after that, the secondary sort of obligation is to your allies, your geographic neighbors. So yeah, in a way, America does have an obligation to kind of, make sure Canada is okay and make sure Mexico is okay, and that, there's no civil war spilling over the borders and things like that. Yeah, you do have sort of an obligation secondarily to your own country. And then the third was the remote obligation will be the international community and things like that. You can't go around trying to solve problems around, the Middle East and Eastern Europe when you have a crisis in your own country. That is just completely backwards. And I personally think that's why, Donald Trump won the election, because he's rather than going fighting wars overseas and, trying to be the world's policeman, how about we just fix our own country first? And the majority of Americans said yeah, absolutely. That sounds like common sense to me.
Yeah, the last administration was more interested in defending the border of Ukraine than the southern border of the United States, and the people spoke. They wanted something different. I've seen you post this phrase before on your X timeline. Tolerance is not a Christian virtue. It kind of sounds like one. Why is it not?
Well, that comes down to the individual's interpretation of what tolerance means. People tend to think that tolerance just means that we love everyone for exactly who they are and what they do, and you just have to accept that. And we believe in radical individualism. So if someone thinks X, Y, and Z, then you are morally obliged to accept that and encourage that, and whatever makes them happy. I don't believe that at all, and I don't think if you're a Catholic, you should actually, or even a Christian, that's acceptable, because there are certain things that are morally and just ontologically wrong, and you can believe in a delusion, but I'm not going to encourage you. I don't tolerate that. Okay, let me quantify this. You tolerate persons because, and again, I've said this multiple times, you tolerate the person because they're made in the image and likeness of God, and every person has an inherent value and inherent dignity and all those things, and every life is equal because, like I said, we're all made in the image and likeness of God. We all have that imago Dei, but you don't tolerate evil principles, okay? So, for example, if someone is, because I used the example before, someone is a person who really believes in the plight of the poor, and they, are an advocate for liberation theology. I respect that person and I tolerate that person, and I pray that they, fulfill their purpose in life and that they live a virtuous and moral life. But I don't tolerate liberation theology because it's wrong, and I don't care. It's pretty simple.
For people who have maybe heard the phrase but might not be able to define it, how would you define liberation theology?
Liberation theology is essentially this. Look, it's getting a bit. Now it's going to get into a bit of speculative areas. a lot of people would assert that liberation theology was spread into South America to destabilize basically a very Catholic and Christian bloc. Like South America is historically very Catholic, and obviously there are a lot of Protestants down there too, but it's a very Catholic sort of continent. And liberation theology was exported from the Soviet Union into South America in order to like destabilize the nation or the continent, sorry, and then also create like a geopolitical sort of alliance between South America and the Soviet Union. And obviously we see that like, the overthrows with, Che Guevara and all that stuff. But liberation theology is essentially the weaponization of the gospel in a way that Jesus is made to, is portrayed as kind of like this social justice activist who was not actually fighting, not actually, it's kind of like using like a Marxist interpretation or a hermeneutic or a historiography of Marxism on the gospel, where you read everything that Jesus does in light of a class struggle or class warfare between Jesus, who represents the poor and oppressed, and the Pharisees, who represent like the elite and the aristocrats and like the capitalists or whatever you want to call it. So everything is read in that line. So it's not actually about the mitzvot and fulfilling the Shema Yisrael, loving the Lord your God with your whole heart, with your whole soul, with your whole might, and following the mitzvot and all that stuff. It's not actually about that. It's actually about the gospel is actually about Jesus liberating the poor. So everything has sort of like this social justice element. And again, it's like just class warfare superimposed onto the gospel. So that is that's kind of like the mantra of liberation theology. So it's kind of like weaponizing the masses and the poor against the state but under the guise of Christianity, because apparently Jesus is now a revolutionary. So that's basically liberation theology, and that's why even Pope Francis, a lot of people can accuse him of being an advocate or a student of liberation theology just because he's from South America, but he has repeatedly condemned liberation theology as being incompatible with the Catholic faith. Even though, yes, we do agree that, we always have to have a preferential option for the poor and assist those who need, who can't help themselves. I'm not saying that at all. But in the way that I've explained it, that sort of mentality where salvation and the faith is actually just about class warfare and liberation, I guess you could say, is not actually compatible with sacred scripture.
Just a minute ago, we were talking about tolerance is not a Christian virtue. Of course, in the United States, we have a constitutional right to free speech. And yet, so many people that promote pornography use this constitutional right and say that gives us a right. But I've heard you say this before, that evil doesn't have a right to exist, even if it's in a category of rights. Expound on that a little.
Yeah, so every individual is, as I've said before, we're made in the image and likeness of God, and people are trying to think that like, oh, okay, that means that God the Father has like a body and he's flying around in space, and the way that we're made in the image and likeness of God is that we have an immortal soul that is obviously created by God. We have free will, and we have a rational intellect. That's how we're made in the image and likeness of God. We have the free will, the immortal soul, and we have a rational intellect. We can create, we can speak, but that's how we're made in His image and likeness. So you can use your freedom to do anything that is in accordance with virtue and goodness and ontologically right. To worship, adore, love God, live your life, and live it to the full, as it says in John 10:10. You have within reason, you have the right to do whatever you want. So if one of your children says to you, I want to learn to play the guitar, sure, go for it. I want to be a nurse, go for it. I want to be a doctor, go for it. That because you have the freedom to do whatever you want within the limits of reason and within, if it's in accordance with your nature and if it's right. You have the right to do things that are good. You have the right to live virtuously in any way that is possible. You don't have the right to do that which is evil. You can do it, but you're actually abusing your free will and your rational intellect, and you're, I guess, violating the fact that you're made in the image and likeness of God. So yes, you can be a murderer if you want to. You can use your free will and you can murder someone. But do you have a right to murder someone? No, you don't. It's just that simple. People conflate power and authority in today's day and age, and they conflate license with liberty. So what that means is power and authority. Authority is when you you actually have an ordained right to do something. Okay, so like a father has the right to govern his children. That is you have authority over that. A bishop has authority over his diocese as given to him by God in accordance with the economy of grace and natural order. And the same thing applies to the family. I don't have a right to break into my neighbor's house because my children are hungry, even though that might save their life. You don't have a right to do that because that's wrong. So that's the first thing. We conflate power and authority. You have the power to do things. I can physically overpower someone, but I don't have the authority to take what belongs to them because then I'm violating their rights, I guess you could say. Then we have this idea of license and licentiousness and liberty. So we have the liberty to pursue that which is true, good, and beautiful. As you always talk about Catholic frequency, you're always talking about how things are good, true, and beautiful. These three transcendental properties. You have the right to pursue anything. If you want to be an author, a poet, you can do whatever you want. But you don't have the license, which is this unrestricted freedom to engage in every single type of action, and that everyone else just has to accept that. So you don't have the license to, like you used in your example, it's freedom of speech to spread pornography. I don't think that's a right. You don't have a right to do that. I don't care if you believe in rights of, in respect to your particular country. I don't think that's a right because you have the right to do something that's wrong. You can have the power to do it. You can be given the conditions that allow you to do such a thing, but I don't think it's right. It's not just my opinion. It's just common sense. But okay, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Of course. I think we live in this modern media age, certainly for the last 50, 60, 70 years, television and radio. There's a lot of propaganda. And I think a lot of certainly Americans have come to see how the major networks like CNN are literally just propaganda machines, but they twist the meanings of words, right? So in classical education, freedom would mean something like the freedom to make the right decisions, right? To live virtuously. They would teach you about the virtues, where modern education doesn't really do that. They teach you that freedom is do whatever the hell you want, right? Indulge your carnal desires, that's freedom. It's very individualistic. Talk about that, first of all, the meaning of words and how I think through prudence, we can see through things we have to try, because a lot of times the propaganda messages appeal to our human nature, which is fallen, and we kind of want to believe things to be easier or give me what I want. Talk about using prudence to see through things that are not always the case.
Well, what you were just saying then in regards to using language, I just thought of George Orwell's 1984. If you have the ability to control language and you have the ability to manipulate semantics, you have the ability to control what people say and think. And in doing that, you control people. I think that's self-evident over the last couple of years, what's been happening in, like the media, social media, mainstream media. That's another reason why I believe Latin is so important, because there's so many accounts here on X that will teach people Latin, and Latin is unchanging. People say it's a dead language. I go, no, it's a solid language that is unchanging. When you have a liturgy or prayers whose meaning is incapable of change because it's so specific and is not subject to the vicissitudes of time and people's dispositions, that's the perfect language to have a liturgy in, because it doesn't change. That's why, again, even if you look in the East, they have their liturgies in Aramaic. You go, Koine Greek in, the Eastern rites and things like that. That's a fantastic, reason or justification to keep sacred languages in liturgy. In regards to your idea about liberty, it's funny. I actually had a conversation with someone about this on X, and I think I even made a post about it where I said, it was basically a conversation with someone who was an atheist, or like a Nietzschean sort of political thinker, I guess you could say. And I said, basically, all atheists are just Luciferians masquerading as humanists. And again, it caused a bit of a stir, because people's natural response is, well, I'm not a Luciferian because I don't even believe in God, or whatever their response was. But my answer was, the single commandment of Luciferianism is do what thou wilt, that shall be the whole of the law. And what that means is the guiding principle of that philosophical and religious mindset is that you are the arbiter of reason. You are the arbiter of what is true and good, and in your disordered way, I guess you could say, what's true, good, and beautiful. And you impose that sort of philosophy or that mentality onto the world. So if you think a particular act is right and good, then you have the right to do that because you are the deterministic factor in what you consider to be eudaimonia. So it's a very weird inversion of reality. So I think it shows that, I know it sounds very dark, but society is becoming a little bit more Luciferian because individuals there's this sort of like philosophical immanentism where you are the principle of right and judgment. And I think when you do that and you remove, I guess you could say, the guiding principles of religion, you create a more destructive and disordered society. And I think it's very self-evident that that's happening right now. We seem to lack, again, when you're talking about the semantics and the changing of words, when you look at something like justice, and I've even said it a couple of times, the idea of social justice, that's not even a word. Justice is by definition a social act because justice is to render another their due. It's inherently social. So what's the purpose of saying social justice? It's just a way to kind of create this new form of justice that apparently is justice, but it's just something completely different. So we have to take words back. I know that sounds strange to say, but what we tend to do online, and I've seen it myself and I've even done it myself, is you fall into the trap of defending false premises because the language that you're using is even correct. So you're forced to fight or to argue or defend within these strange parameters that you've engaged in. If you just say, just straight up, I don't actually agree with your premise at all, and so I just don't have an obligation to answer you because just your philosophical groundwork is so fundamentally wrong. If that person can't accept that, then I can't help you.
Talking about definition of words, there's a word that politicians use a lot. They talk about their values, and I think they want us to think that they're virtues. But the Democratic Party, for example, would consider abortion, being in support of that, as a value, right? So when they talk about their values, I think you have to. Values are not inherently good or bad. It's very neutral, where all virtues are good, right?
Correct. A value can be anything. So like I can value, drinking coffee. I value it. It's a good time. I'm drinking coffee right now. I enjoy it. That's not a virtue. Drinking coffee is not a virtue because a virtue is something that leads to individual human flourishing in accordance with our ontological, purpose. So something like, as you mentioned, women's reproductive rights, again, changing the language rather than saying abortion, it's now to women's reproductive rights. We just change it and make it sound nice so that people don't actually engage with the concept, because by changing or lessening the blow of what you're talking about, it makes people think of it as being something different than what it is. And I know we can see that in many different examples in society. There are virtues and there are vices and there are things that are morally neutral. So again, when people talk about I don't necessarily want that'll open a big rabbit hole. But yeah, so there's even when we're talking about the prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, which are the cardinal virtues. These are like the main virtues that you need to have. But there's actually sub virtues, or what Saint Thomas Aquinas and even Aristotle say are the daughters of the cardinal virtues, because cardinal in Latin means like the head. They're the main head virtues, and from those flow these other sub virtues. So one of the examples that I'll use is justice. So we've mentioned this before. Justice is to render another their due. So you basically give them what they're owed. So Catholic frequency, let's say you lend me $100. Justice demands that I give that $100 back to you. Not $99, not $105, $100. That's justice, because I'm rendering back to you what you're due, which is that $100. Justice doesn't only apply between human beings. There's also justice within every order of creation. And the main and most important form of justice is to render unto God what is due unto God. And that's why Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and render unto God what is God's. Because you have when you actually, people don't think about this, when you actually live a vicious and disordered life, you're actually committing an injustice against God, because he created you to glorify him through your works and your deeds, and you're not. So you must make an account and you must repair that. And that's where we get this idea of reparation. You must fix that. So that's why, and again, this obviously delves into a different topic of like purgatory and punishment and, temporal punishment and things like that. But justice is when you render unto another what is due to them. So if someone is, okay, so let's use an example, the Pope. If you are a Catholic, you might disagree with him on his personal opinions or whatever. If you don't render respect and, how can I put this? Let's just say respect. If you do not respect his authority and respect his position as being the successor to Saint Peter, you are committing an injustice to him. Okay, because you have to respect the divinely instituted economy of grace and order of creation that God has established. Okay, so a lot of very traditional Catholics will just go online, just start slamming the Pope. And again, don't get me wrong, there are some things that he says or does that I don't necessarily agree with, but in doing that, you're actually committing a greater injustice because you're actually not deferring or showing respect and honor to one who is your spiritual and ontological superior. I'm not saying he's holier than you or that he's better than you, but ontologically and magisterially speaking, yes, he is. Just like a father is ontologically has authority over a child, the child has to obey the parent within reason. Okay, obviously a parent can be a tyrant, obviously a pope can be a tyrant, a bishop can be a tyrant, a politician can be a tyrant, but you have a natural obligation in accordance with justice to show them respect. So you would see, I think it was in, I can't remember, it might have been New Zealand or something, where like the King Charles went to England and he got like, it was almost like this flash mob of like protesters that were screaming at him and things like that. That's not in accordance with justice. That man is actually a monarch and the monarch of your country. And you might disagree with him, but you're not rendering him justice, which is respect in accordance with his role. And what you think about him as an individual is actually irrelevant. So when you think about something like the virtue of justice, you actually, there are, like 10 virtues that are in accordance with justice. And one of those is actually patriotism. Patriotism is a virtue in accordance with justice because you're rendering your country what is due to it. And because your country, as Saint Thomas Aquinas explains in the Summa, it has nourished you and given you protection and life, just like your parents have, you actually have a moral obligation to love your country and to defend your country. So again, that's where a lot of the revolutionaries, they might say, oh, I'm showing justice because I'm caring for the poor. Well, actually, no, you're actually sinning against justice because you lack the virtue of patriotism. So it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. And people have this very skewed understanding of like what's right and what's wrong or what's a virtue and what's a vice. But in reality, they're actually showing that they have almost no idea about what's a virtue and what's a vice. So when you look on the flip side, you might think of like a vice that's contrary to justice. So you might say, let's say, idolatry, okay, because I use the idea of, rendering God his due. So idolatry is actually a vice contrary to justice because what you're doing is you're rendering undue worship and adoration to a created thing when that worship and adoration should be directed to God. So you're actually detracting from his glory because you owe him that adoration and worship and you're giving it to something else instead. So to use my example with you, Catholic Frequency, if I borrowed $100 off you and you said, can you please give me that money back? And I say, sure, hey, Memory Medieval, or hey, Nina Murphy, here's the $100. That's unjust because I'm giving that money that belongs to you to someone else, and that is a vice.
For people who are not familiar with philosophical terms, you use this phrase a few times, ontological. Explain what that is, just as you would somebody in their very first philosophy class. Sure. So ontology is basically it's like a philosophical study of existence. So it's basically understand the reality of things, why things are the way they are, like their purpose. So ontologically speaking, or you look at something and you think about why does it exist and what is its purpose of existing. So if I would use an example, Aristotle uses so let's look at what Aristotle calls the four causes. And this is something that we've spoken about before, and I'll just do like a very quick run through it. So the four causes are basically what brings something into being.
So the first cause is like the material cause. So if we were to look at the table, and I used this example before, a table is made up of, let's just say it's a wooden table. This table, its material cause is the wood. That's what it's made of. That's its physical matter. It's its substance. Then we've got like the formal cause, the second one. And that's the form that it takes. So what's the difference between a chair and a table? Well, they have different formal causes. One's meant to have things placed on it, and one is meant to be sat on. Technically, yes, you can sit on a table, but it wasn't designed for that. Okay, it wasn't designed for sitting on. Then you look at its efficient cause, the efficient cause of what brings something into being. So I could have a pile of wood, and I might want to have something to place my coffee on, but unless someone actually builds that table, nothing's going to happen. It's just still going to be a pile of wood. And then the final cause, which is the telos, and then this falls under the whole umbrella of its ontological purpose, I guess you could say, is the purpose or the goal for which that thing was created. It's a reason why it exists. So the final cause of this table is that it's sturdy, that I can place my coffee on it with the assurance that this table will not cave in and fall down and break. Okay? Because if I place my coffee cup on it and the whole table collapses, it's a bad table, because it can't do the one thing that it was made to do, which it's telos, which is to hold things for me. It holds my laptop and it's holding my coffee right now. Okay, it has failed in its purpose, and that in that way, it's actually defective. It's not good. So to bring that back to your original point, why do we talk about these things? Well, what are the four causes of a human being? We have a material cause. That's, our bodies. We're made up of bones, organs, tissue, things like that. And then we have our formal cause. And there's like two formal causes. We have our physical formal cause, which is like our genetics and our DNA and things like that. But then we also have a soul. And the soul gives us our rational intellect. And that's what gives us our humanity, I guess you could say, as opposed to like a gorilla or a monkey that has almost the same sort of like form as us from a natural point of view. They have fingers and arms and bodies and stuff. Obviously, we don't have tails. But we are almost like formally identical, but on a spiritual level, no, we're not, because they don't have rational intellects. We do. They don't have immortal souls, but we do. And they don't have necessarily free will. We do. They have instinct. And then we look at the efficient cause. And the efficient cause of a human being is obviously your parents. Don't think about that too long. But then on a supernatural level, your efficient cause is God, because God created your soul. But then it brings us to the final part, is what's your final cause? And that's the purpose for which you were created. So my question to you, Catholic Frequency, is, why were you created?
To do spaces with you on X.
Oh man, you are too kind. No, like the purpose for what you created is to glorify God through your thoughts, through your words, and your deeds. And people don't do that. So if I were to use my previous analogy with the table, if you don't do that for which you were created, you're not living to your potential. You're not achieving eudaimonia. You're actually to use the technical term, a disordered human being. And unfortunately, we live in a society where most people are disordered because they lack virtue, because they don't know their purpose, whether out of ignorance or out of, personal choice. And they actually celebrate those things that actually detract from their own humanity. They dehumanize themselves, and they don't actually know what virtue is. And they praise things that are vices, and they shun things that are virtues. So when you wonder why is society falling apart, it's because people are lacking the most basic fundamental aspects of being a human being. And again, this is not to say that, everyone has to be a practicing Catholic in order to have like a functioning society. I'm not saying that. Obviously, that's an ideal. But like even on a natural level, we don't even have natural virtue anymore, because we promote things that are completely against our human nature. So that's why society is crumbling. Yes, you could still have functioning societies where people aren't Catholic or aren't Christian, and they still, look at ancient China. Ancient China was thriving. It's a powerful nation. They're not Christian, but they had natural virtues. Like Confucianism is a naturally virtuous sort of like philosophical framework that built one of the greatest civilizations in world history. You look at the Romans, Stoicism is naturally virtuous. Yes, they don't know who Jesus Christ is. Yes, Marcus Aurelius used to kill Christians, and people always say to me like, haha, you like Stoicism. Did you know that Marcus Aurelius killed Christians? Like, yeah, bro, I know that. But you don't understand that the natural virtue leads to, opens one's predisposition up to supernatural virtue. Not to say that nature becomes supernature, but Saint Thomas Aquinas says Grace does not destroy nature, it perfects it. When someone is naturally virtuous, it lends them to accepting supernatural truth and supernatural revelation. That's why Christianity spread in the Greco-Roman world so quickly and first, because they were already a naturally virtuous society, so it predisposed them to accepting the gospel. That's why, in my personal opinion, I've said this about 2-3 years ago, I kind of, not because I'm special or anything, but I called the fact that Christianity would make a huge resurgence. And again, I've spoken about him before, and I do credit that a lot to Jordan Peterson, because he made Stoicism mainstream again. Whether he tried to or not, even though he talks a lot about Nietzsche and stuff like that, he made Stoicism, and I think that guy Ryan Holiday or whatever his name is, that guy who writes about Marcus Aurelius, and there's a lot of accounts on X that do that. When you make Stoicism popular again, when you make natural virtue popular again, and then you introduce supernatural revelation, everyone starts seeing the crossover. They're like, okay, Christianity actually complements natural virtue very, very well. And that's why those societies that had a naturally virtuous sort of foundation accepted Christianity so quickly. So that's what I think we're in that process right now in society, where natural virtue and natural reason and common sense, and like, you're seeing with, like, as we were saying before, like the Trump administration, JD Vance, they're starting to promote these naturally virtuous concepts that are kind of like correcting society, for lack of a better term. And then from that, we can then build on nature and supernaturalize it, if that makes sense.
You had a bold post the other day. You posted a picture of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, and you said, "America will become a Catholic nation." I like that. One day, right?
Yeah, it's pretty controversial, but I do think that whether or not people realize that it does seem to be heading that way. A lot of people say that, a lot of people in the comments got really angry when I said it. They said, didn't you know America was built by Puritans, and did you know that, we're a Protestant nation? And I said, yes, I'm very aware of history. I'm not saying that Catholics literally came to it. Well, technically Catholics did come to America and found it because the Spanish did. But I'm not saying that the founding fathers of America were all, blessed by the Pope and founded the country. But people don't realize that and again, most of this audience here, just flicking through the pictures, I see a lot of American flags. And people don't realize that the founding fathers of America, and I do actually believe that America is probably one of the best countries in the world, top 10 in like world history. Why? Because your constitution is pretty much like a remake of the Roman constitution, and it was done by design, and it's very, very good. When it functions well, it's fantastic. And that's why America became a superpower. The problem is that, unfortunately, your country and your leaders haven't been, living in accordance with your constitution, and that's why it has been going downhill. But people don't realize that, okay, most of the founders of America weren't Catholic, but the founders of America were inspired and formed in the intellectual tradition of Saint Thomas Aquinas, Francisco Suarez, and Robert Bellarmine, just as much as they were by Montesquieu and John Locke and Cicero and all these other people. They don't realize. And again, I'm not taking shots at America, because I actually think your country is fantastic, but people tend to think, especially on X, I've noticed this very weird dynamic where everyone kind of thinks that the world just spontaneously materialized in 1776, and they don't realize all the history that went before it. And they don't understand the dynamics of history in Europe and the Western world in general, and what came about to bring about the American Revolution. It's just like, there was the Dark Ages, Rome fell, the Catholic Church basically impoverished everyone by making them buy indulgences for 1,500 years. Martin Luther did something, and then 1776. That's pretty much world history, according to most of the comments that I receive. And I'm not taking shots at everyone in general, because there are actually a lot of Protestant Christians that I've met here on X that are actually great people that I have really good conversations with, especially during DMs and stuff like that. And they've actually helped me understand Protestant theology a little bit more, and I really respect their opinions. Obviously, at the end of the day, I don't agree with them on all their points, or else I'll be a Protestant too. But I still respect the intellectual sort of exchange and the genuine dialogue. And I'm not saying that like in this sort of like modernist sort of like, let's dialogue with people. People think that when I ask these questions online that I'm taking shots at Protestants because I don't like them. I love you guys. We're brothers and sisters in Christ. You're baptized, I'm baptized. We worship one God. I will always defend you, and I'll always fight for you, and we are together in what's happening right now. Obviously, I don't agree with every theological premise that you have, or else, again, I'll be a Methodist or I'll be an Anglican or whatever it is. But people think that I'm just taking shots at them, but in reality, I'm just sparking a conversation because, again, I want to know, what do you believe? And I've actually realized in these last few exchanges that I've had is that there seems to be a massive disparity even within Protestants about certain Protestant doctrines. And a lot of the people probably would only see the main post that I do and they say like, oh, you're taking shots at Protestants or whatever it is. But you actually, and I'm not going to expose these or share these, but you don't actually see the hundreds of DMs that I get of Protestant Christians saying, you know what, I've been actually thinking about joining the Catholic Church for a long time. This post made me think about X, Y, and Z. That's what I care about. Like I want to help people, and I'm not here to just go on the offensive all the time and just upset people, but I'm trying to, in a way, educate people. Yes, sometimes I am being a little bit edgy. I recognize that, but it's just getting that conversation happening as well. Because when, even as a Catholic, I learn the most about Catholicism when a Protestant or like an Orthodox person challenges me, because then I actually have to think about what I know. And in doing that, it either reinforces or it breaks your presuppositions. Because if I think that, I have a certain principle that I believe in, and then for example, an Orthodox Christian challenges me on like the papacy or the universality of Rome's authority, and I'm like, oh yeah, I never actually thought of that before. Then I actually have to think about that, and either I'm wrong and Catholicism is wrong, or I actually have to research, and it forces me to do that. So that's what I'm encouraging other people to do. And I think that's one of the ways that X is a great place, because we can actually have these conversations, and it is a little bit more intellectual. Obviously, there's always going to be those, not crazy people, but people on both sides who are just going to attack people and say, oh, all you Protestants are evil, and then all the Protestants will say, all you Catholics are evil and you worship Mary and stuff. And that doesn't help anyone. And I don't like those conversations because they're not productive. But I'm always for opening those channels of communication with other people. Just because they don't think exactly like me doesn't mean I'm automatically against you or belligerent towards you or hostile towards you. I just like conversation. I find it fun because it helps me learn.
Yeah, you can't evangelize people that don't have some kind of relationship with, and part of that's just talking to people, having a conversation. I posted something a few weeks ago about, I see a lot of because I'm a Protestant convert, and I see a lot of Catholics that are, beating Protestants over the head. Yes, they might be wrong about whatever, but it's like, you really think you're going to convert them? Like, that's the goal, right? Is conversion, not to make them hate you or hate the Virgin Mary more or hate the Pope more. And boy, you'd have thought I posted some kind of heresy because I had all these comments and private messages, how terrible I was. But
yeah, I still stand. I agree, and I still stand by the fact that anyone who jumps online and just sits there and says, is completely hostile and belligerent, whether it's a Catholic, like I even hate it when I see Catholics who would just say, they'll have this massive post just slamming 15 points about, Lutherans or Orthodox or what. I don't like that. I don't think that's helpful. We are separated brothers and sisters in Christ. The Great Schism and the Protestant Revolt, Reformation, whatever you want to call it, I personally think are two of the greatest tragedies in world history. It was up to me. If I could change anything in the world today, I would make all the Christian churches united immediately. And not like some weird syncretistic sort of like mega church, like a genuine reunification. To me, that's all that matters. I know this sounds strange. I actually don't care about anything else. People always ask me about all these other topics. I don't actually care. To me, all that matters is Orthodox and Catholics and Anglicans and Lutherans and Episcopalians and Methodists. We need to become one church again. That's honestly what I believe, and I pray for that every single day. So I don't like whether it's Catholics or anyone else just going in and start attacking other people just relentlessly, because that's all you're doing is just making people hate you. So like again, like you said, I get really annoyed sometimes where, okay, here's a bit of honesty. I can understand from a natural point of view when I read a Protestant's post and they say, for example, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was corrupt, they were selling indulgences, popes did X, Y, and Z. I absolutely agree with that. And I genuinely think that most of those bishops are probably in hell and they deserve it, okay? From a natural point of view, I understand that justification and I understand that line of reasoning that you want, like, Germans want to leave the church because of corruption and stuff like that. There were underlying issues like political issues and stuff. But from a natural point of view, I understand that concept. Same thing with the Orthodox Christians. I understand the geopolitical shift and the filioque. Like I understand that. But to just say like you Catholics worship Mary, I have never met a single Catholic in my life that worships Mary. And if you're a Catholic and you worship Mary, you are a pagan. You're not Catholic. I don't know what you are, but you're not Catholic. So just like these silly posts that are just such low IQ posts, just slamming other people, is just so ridiculous to me. And I can't stand it. I've actually learned a lot. Like when I've done these posts about like sola fide and sola scriptura and that, I've actually seen in real time, because where I live, there's no Protestants. There's predominantly Catholics. There's a lot of Eastern Catholics, a lot of Western Catholics, a lot of people that follow Islam, and just no religion. That's pretty much the region that I live in. So I've realized that my perception of Protestantism is basically just like what I see, which is like evangelicals. And I've realized in real time just how different like Lutheran and Episcopalian and Methodist theology is to evangelical theology. Like it's radically different. So even I'm learning in real time. And again, yeah, I can read like 5 books about it, but I actually find that boring. I don't want to sit there and just read some guy from like the 1800s, what he said. I actually want to speak to real life people and get what they want to understand what they believe, because then that gives me a better gauge about where the culture is and where people are and what people think. And actually finding out like, yeah, you know what? Most Protestants actually don't subscribe to certain parts of the soul, like the 5 solas and things like that. So that's actually interesting to me. But yeah, I know we've deviated a little bit off point, but what that kind of ties back to is at the very fundamental level, whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, whatever, we're all striving for the natural and supernatural virtues, and we should encourage each other to get there. That's probably how I'll draw that back. We have to work together to make society better. And whether you live in a Protestant nation or a Catholic nation or an Orthodox nation, Christianity is the true religion because it leads to human flourishing. It promotes the virtues and the sub-virtues. It leads to the flourishing of the individual. It leads to the flourishing of communities. It makes them strong. It makes them virtuous. And that is why the Western world dominated for like 1,500 years, is because we were under the framework of a religious tradition that encouraged human flourishing both on a natural and supernatural level. That's why the greatest works of art are cathedrals and basilicas and paintings and frescoes and architecture and all these things. Why are they all in Christian nations? And I'm not saying that only Christians can build beautiful things, but why are 99% of them in Christian nations? It's because we lived under a framework that encouraged human flourishing both on an artistic, creative, mathematical, scientific level, and that encouraged or promoted achievement and success and beauty and truth and goodness. That's not to say that other cultures can't accomplish that to a degree, but that's why it's so dominant in the West, is because we had 1,500 years of uninterrupted Christianity that facilitated our growth and development. So again, it comes back to that principle that faith, that grace doesn't destroy nature, it perfects it. Grace takes what is good, true, and beautiful about you as an individual, and it makes it better. It supernaturalizes it. Paul was already a zealous, when you read the New Testament, Paul was already a zealous Pharisee who was able to preach and knew the law so well. And then with grace, he was actually able to supernaturalize it and start preaching in favor of Christ. And his epistles are phenomenal. And that's why we still read them today, because grace did not destroy his nature. It perfected him. It made him stronger. It made him better. It made him more fluent. It made him more articulate. It made him more, dominant. It made him formidable in all these ways. In every way that he was naturally gifted, grace supercharged that. So if you have a culture that's already naturally virtuous and then you supernaturalize it with grace, it just becomes a better culture. I know that's a controversial statement to say, but yes, some cultures are inherently better than others because they lead to human flourishing. It's pretty simple.
Our friend Jeremy Wayne Tate posts a lot about how people who are atheists, flock to Rome and flock to Paris, and they go to the great cathedrals and they're mesmerized. They love it. And yet we don't build these things because as a culture, a majority of us don't believe what our ancestors believed. I'm going to give a plug to our friend Humble Flow, who's in here. He just posted about an hour ago a great thread on How much Thomas Aquinas has shaped Western thought. 50 lessons from history's greatest minds. So everybody check out that thread, give it a repost. And in our final moments, Imperator, I don't want to divert too much, but maybe just in 60 seconds or so, because we talked about, when we talked about this space, maybe we'd talk about this, but in the news last week, there was something about Joe Biden, the former president of the United States, had become a Freemason. If that's true, why is that a bad thing for a Catholic?
I like that we're ending on a light note. According to Catholic teaching, I guess you could say, even to the 1917 Code of Canon Law, if a person is a Freemason, they are late sententiae excommunicated from the Catholic Church, because you're belonging to an order that is completely antithetical to not only the Christian religion, but also the Catholic Church specifically, in accordance with like their charters and things like that. People tend to think that it's a very like it's just a fraternity, we're all friends, we do charities, and yeah, they do that. But people don't realize, without getting very dark, that they swear allegiances to the Grand Architect, and the Grand Architect, when you go to the higher levels, is actually Lucifer. So again, ties back to that Luciferianism that I was speaking about before, where do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. That's why you see so much corruption in the world, is because a lot of these people who are in positions of power in our world actually are part of these organizations such as Freemasonry that are designed and whose mission it is to destroy Western civilization primarily through the Catholic Church. And that's why we've seen so much infiltration of the Catholic Church. And because these people aren't actually loyal to it, they're just using it to further their own agenda. And your former president is a perfect example of that.
Let's end on something more positive. There's been a lot of stress and negativity the last few years in the Western world, but I know for me as an American, there seems to be a vibe shift in the West, even that goes beyond the borders of the United States with the election of Donald Trump. And there's a lot of high-profile conversions to the Catholic Church. There's some positive signs coming out around the world in the West that maybe people are waking up. Do you sense this vibe shift? Are you optimistic about the future?
Absolutely. If you find just in the culture has already started to change, it's something that's been happening for a long time, but obviously because it doesn't get publicized or wasn't publicized on social media and things like that, you would have thought that this is one of the reasons why X is so amazing, because you would have probably thought 5 years ago, I'm like the only person who thinks this, no one else talks about this, I'm completely alone. And then you jump on X, and because there's freedom of speech, you realize, wow, there are like 100,000 people who think the exact thing that I'm thinking. I'm not alone. There are other people who can see this just like me. There's absolutely a vibe shift. As I was saying before, the world is becoming it's veering more towards natural virtue again. Common sense is starting to return. We're starting to see principles like, the Vice President of America speaking about Aquinas and principles of subsidiarity. You had a Catholic president for like 4 years and never heard anything like that. So you're starting to see this transition back to reason, to natural virtue. And again, that lays the foundation for true evangelization, because you can't evangelize someone who doesn't at least have the natural foundation. I'm absolutely seeing that. Just due to the nature of my work, I've noticed that young people in particular are very, very conservative. I don't know what it might be like in your area or where you live, but people that I'm finding, young people in particular, are incredibly conservative, whether that's Christian or just on a natural point of view, and that's rising exponentially. And I do think that you're finding that Christianity is starting to wake up. And again, if you look at what's happening around the world, and look what's happening in Europe and things like that, it actually is, I know it's tragic to say because horrible things have happened, but it actually is a blessing in disguise, because I think that the Western world has been too dominant and too complacent for far too long. And it's finally starting to realize that the source of our strength was our God. And they're starting to return. You look at all these countries in Europe, for example, that are strong. Like look at something like Poland. Why is Poland so strong? Because they're unbelievably Catholic. Look at a place like even an Orthodox country like Serbia. Why is Serbia so strong? They're unbelievably Orthodox. That lends itself to flourishing, because they, above all else, they love God, they love their country, they love their families, and that promotes a sort of like, again, because they have the cardinal virtue of justice, because they render unto God what is God's. They then have the sub virtue, or the daughter, which is, as I spoke about before, patriotism, because patriotism flows from justice. So why is it that all these incredibly Christian countries are also very patriotic because it flows from the virtue. That's why America, for the first 200 years or so of its existence, was such a patriotic country, because they were hardcore Christians. Obviously, they weren't Catholic. And that's not to detract from that, but they're hardcore traditional Christians who love God and love justice, and as a consequence of that, they're very patriotic. So you start to see how like all these virtues start to weave in together. And I'm realizing now, as I'm saying this last little part, that we're kind of deviated off our original topic a little bit, but that's just the nature of this space, and that's why I love talking to you. I always say this, but that definitely means we have to do another one to continue where we left off.
We always go off topic, but that's okay because we set the topic. So we're editing in real time. I think before we go, I think maybe if it's okay with you, Imperator, we'll end the way we did last time, which is with the St. Michael prayer in English, and you do it in Latin. But before we go, I just wanted to thank you. I think this is our 5th or 6th or 7th space. I can't keep up with it. It's good to be back sort of in a regular routine of at least once a month. And I always learn so much from you. I see you're approaching, in the not too distant future, the 50,000 follower mark. So as you go into the big time, just don't forget your friends that are smaller. Okay.
Mate, I can't believe it, to be honest, that it's even gotten this far. I just started this as a little side hobby, just sharing quotes and pictures like that, and I can't believe it's actually gotten this far. You've grown heaps. You've gone up like 15,000-20,000 in the last month or so, haven't you?
Not that much. I'm riding in your wake, so pull me up.
I don't know. Your spaces, even your videos. I think last night I jumped on and I saw like one of your live videos had like 700 or 800 people in it. That's amazing.
Trying to stay busy so I can stay out of trouble. So that's the goal.
Well, you're doing God's work. Like what you do, and I said this before, is incredible. Not just having me as a guest, but just the guests that you bring on to your spaces, the people that you connect with one another. I always have the best conversations with people after the spaces that I'll do with you, because you just connect these great. You're able to capture this great audience of people, and just like the fact that you're promoting things like the rosary and the threads that you've been doing and the images. Like honestly, I said it before, favorite account. You just bring so much beauty, truth, and goodness to this platform, and honestly, I love the fact that we got to connect over X. So I'm always down to do another space whenever you want, and we can call it whatever we want, because I know we're not going to be on topic, but that's okay.
We'll just call it this and that. You got to move to the United States so we get rid of the 16-hour time difference, and we can do a space every day. So
yeah, definitely.
All right, let's end with the Saint Michael prayer. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who wander through the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen.
Sancte Michael, Arcangele, defende nos in proelio, contra nequitiam et insidias diaboli est praesidium. Imperatili Deus supplices te pecamur, tuque princeps militiae celistis. Satanam aliosque spiritus malignos, qui ad perditionem animarum pervergantur in mundo. Divina virtute in inferum detrude. Amen.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Imperator on the virtues. Just a reminder, you can visit our website, catholicfrequency.com, for more content. You can also sign up for our free newsletter there. We'll keep you up to date on upcoming spaces, as well as provide weekly content exclusive to the newsletter.